Hola, bienvenidos a esta cuarta y última mesa de espacio de reflexión de Muro a Muro, parte de la Feria Internacional del Libro. Este espacio ha sido diseñado para reflexionar más allá de las fronteras entre disciplinas académicas sobre las preguntas de fondo que nos plantea la coyuntura global. En esta cuarta y última mesa platicaremos sobre la necesidad de una transformación a los sistemas económicos a fin de generar crecimiento, inclusión y sustentabilidad y evitar que comience lo que algunos empiezan a llamar una década perdida. Para esta mesa tenemos invitados de lujo. Nos acompañan en primer lugar el señor Jacques Attali, un verdadero polígrafo y hombre de renacimiento, lo llamaría yo, que ha escrito más de 80 ensayos de todo tipo de temas, desde ópera, cultura, economía. Fue fundador de la Banca Europea para la Reconstrucción y el Desarrollo y presidente de la Comisión para la Liberación del Desarrollo francés. Actualmente es asesor del presidente Emmanuel Macron y acaba de publicar un libro titulado La economía de la vida, sobre las implicaciones para el mundo y la economía global de la pandemia. Aunque el libro ha sido publicado en francés, próximamente será traducido al español. Nos acompaña también la doctora Nora Lustig, doctora en Economía por la Universidad de California, Berkeley, y titular de la cátedra Samuel Z. Stone de la Economía Latinoamericana y directora del Commitment to Equity Institute de la Universidad de Tulane en Nueva Orleans. Es un miembro senior no residente del Brookings Institute y del Center for Global Development del Inter-American Dialogue. Es una de las primeras economistas que ha dedicado su vida a estudiar temas de desigualdad y es una referencia obligada para cualquier tema de desigualdad en América Latina. Durante los últimos meses ha publicado una serie de ensayos sobre las implicaciones para la pobreza y la desigualdad en la región ante la pandemia y las diferentes reacciones gubernamentales. También nos acompaña la doctora Susan Paulson, que estudió en la Universidad de Chicago y ha vivido más de 15 años en Sudamérica, donde trabajó en diversos programas en Bolivia y Perú y dirigió el área de estudios latinoamericanos de la Universidad de Miami durante 7 años. Ha dedicado su carrera a estudiar las implicaciones sobre género, raza y desigualdad del modelo económico actual. Acaba de publicar en el contexto de la pandemia un ensayo junto con diversos otros autores sobre el caso para el decrecimiento económico en un contexto de pandemia, y recientemente publicó con estos mismos autores un libro sobre el que aboga por el decrecimiento económico. Finalmente nos acompaña el maestro Salomón Chertorivsky, quien ha tenido una larga carrera en el servicio público, incluida titular del Seguro Popular en México, secretario de Salud, que actualmente dirige el Centro de Estudios Pensando en México, y que ha planteado una serie de medidas y de propuestas sobre la economía en México en el contexto de la pandemia. Para esta primera mesa, para esta primera parte de la discusión, nos gustaría platicar en primer momento sobre cuáles son sus impresiones sobre las implicaciones al modelo económico que hemos estado viviendo en México y en todo el mundo durante los últimos 30 años en este contexto de pandemia. Si le parece, les doy la palabra primero al señor Attali para que nos pueda dar sus impresiones sobre cómo ve la situación actual económica.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted and quite honored to be part of this roundtable and to give my views in 10 minutes before we have a global conversation. First, it's clear that the situation we are in is a worldwide, global, and should be looked not only on the economic side, but also on the political side, because the economics cannot be looked at without all the political dimensions. Second, we are going to speak on the possibility of having another model of development, as we see on the title of this roundtable, which is not only a new economic model, but it cannot be a new model economic if it's not also political and ideological. And third, and to begin with, I would say that to succeed with the pandemic and to get rid of it, even if we think that we need another model, we don't need it to get rid of a pandemic. Because if you look at which countries have been able to master, avoid the pandemics, you see countries which are quite classical capitalist countries or quite classical communist countries. China, of course, but mainly if I take the example of a country which, in my view, is the most successful in the world in taking care of the pandemics is South Korea. And the example of South Korea is very simple. They took the problem early. They were ready in December because they faced such a pandemic at a lower scale 5 years ago. And they were ready for very simple things, which is mask, test, and trace. And that's it. And they did it from the very first day. Even the very first day they had cases, they were ready. They had masks. They had the test January 12, which means 2 weeks before having their first case. And after they organized tracing and isolating the contaminated people without any lockdown except schools. And now they have 54 million inhabitants, and they have 400 deaths. And economic growth is limited only by the economic environment of the country. That means that with a classical economy, with only a very, very strong government and decision to impose rules and to be followed by the country and the citizens, these pandemics can be mastered. It's not what has been done elsewhere in many countries. It has been done in Japan, it has been done in Taiwan, it has been done in Singapore, Hong Kong, China on different model, after many, many mistakes of the Chinese because of the lies of the governments, etc. It has not been done in Europe, it has not been done in the US, it has not been done in Mexico, but we must say that discipline and technical availability of techniques will have been enough to solve the pandemics. That doesn't mean that we should not think of another model of development which could help prepare the new pandemics. First, the pandemic should tell us that or something which is obvious for all of us is that everything is global. You cannot get rid of such a problem at a local level. You need to get rid of it at a larger level because the pandemic can come without any border. De Muro a Muro doesn't mean anything for a virus. That means that it's a global problem, which means that we have to find a rule of the games, rule of law at a larger level. Second, it's also a lesson that, and South Korea is an example, that you should take the lessons of the past and be prepared for the future. Now, that means that we, in order to have a sound economic and sound political system, we need to work, as I used to say, in favor of next generations, which means to be prepared to face the threats of the future today, in order when the threat materialize, to be able to do it. And to know today, we know what are the next threats: climate, inequalities, other pandemics, many other threats are coming. This is the case that this is the things that we are supposed to deal with now. Third, it demonstrates that an economy which is a country which is focusing on some sectors are in better position to deal with it. And it's what I call the economy of life. And for me, the economy of life means some very important sectors which should be priorities: health, education, culture, digital, distribution, hygiene, food, agriculture. These are the sectors that should be priorities. And in many countries, these do not represent more than 30% of GDP. Some countries that represent more than 60% are very rare. Usually it's less. That means that on the long run, what is needed is, one, to take care more of the future. Second, to reorient the economy towards the sectors of economy of life and avoid to spend too much money on the others, which are mainly oil, mechanics, chemistry, and many sectors that can enter into that. That means that it needs a certain amount of planning, priorities, orientation, that has to be through a creation of a global consensus in order to get rid of that. And if we do that, we will also deal with the climate urgency, because the economy of life means no fossil fuel, sustainable economics on all dimensions. But this is something very political. This leads to the understanding of that we should get into another model, another balance between market and democracy, with more democracy and less market. more democracy in the sense that democracy should take care of a lot of many issues, and mainly, which is very difficult, to take care of the interest of next generations. In a certain sense, to give right to votes to next generations in order for next generation to be part of a decision-making process. And also, in order to do that, we need to have another kind of ideology, which is why I say it cannot be a new economic model. It has to be a new political model and a new ideological model. The model we are in today, and in which we are going to be more and more if we don't act, is the model of individualism. Individualism is everywhere, not only in the economic models, but it is in politics, in every dimension of our lives, if you look. And the new media, the social networks, everything is linking to the development of individualism, selfishness, narcissism, which at the global level means also to be closed in his own group, which means populism, which may also means closed in a specific group, in a specific gender, and to forget the others in order to create an identity which is very, very limited. That's the trend. If we want to get rid of a pandemic at the long term, if we want to get rid of all the problems I just mentioned, we need to be not in this selfish environment or in selfish ideology, but in altruism. Altruism doesn't mean something naive, which means that you are kind to the others just for joy of being kind. It's something which is very, very rational. It's what I call rational altruism or selfish altruism. If I go to the basic of economics, Adam Smith wrote this very famous book on the wealth of the nations after having written a book on altruism. And he demonstrates that if you want to succeed individually, you need to be altruistic, because if you are not altruistic, you are going to lose your clients, you are going to lose any benefit you get from what you produce. And therefore, we need to move, and it's very a huge challenge today to understand that it is our selfish interest to be altruistic. It is our selfish interest that other people wear masks. It is our selfish interest that other people get vaccine, because that protects us. And this change in ideology is certainly something most difficult we have to do. Plus the fact that we need to be not only altruistic with our neighbors, not only the others around the world, but also altruistic in favor of next generations, because next generations are the condition of our survival. And it's not intuitive. It's not easy to understand why should we take care of next generations. Marx, I mean not Karl Marx, but Groucho Marx said, why should I take care of next generation? They have done nothing to me, for me. It's not true. It's funny, but it's not true. Because suppose there is no more any next generation, no one is born from now on in the future, that's a disaster for everyone which is living today. We have an interest in the well-being of people which are not yet born. This is a condition of our own survival. And this is something quite not intuitive and not easy to understand. Therefore, if we want to have a real solution, it's not only the technologies of South Korea, mask, test, and trace. It's the ideology of altruism within the framework of economy of life that will help to change the whole thing. Of course, it's short and a caricature of my own thinking. I'm happy that the discussion will help have it more nuanced. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Attali. I'd like to ask Dr. Paulson, how would you contrast your views on the case for degrowth and what Monsieur Attali just said, and how do you think the global pandemic and the global recession we're undergoing right now impact or influences your thoughts on economic degrowth?
Oh, thank you. Durante el siglo pasado, la era de expansión que amaneció con el colonialismo europeo se identificó con un ritmo de los científicos llaman la gran aceleración, un ritmo aún más fuerte en los últimos 30 años. El uso de recursos naturales, la generación de residuos, emisiones aumentaron enormemente. Los PIBs se dispararon, los impactos ambientales explotaron. Como Nora Lustig nos demuestra, las diferentes formas de desigualdad humana han ido disminuyendo, aumentando, reorganizándose. Pero una cosa es clara. Los sacrificios y los beneficios del crecimiento están mal distribuidos de manera inconcebiblemente injusta. Eso nos lleva a una paradoja. En todo el mundo, los científicos y activistas piden disminuir la cantidad de materia y energía utilizado por las economías humanas. Pero el metabolismo social global aumenta minuto a minuto, ya que los políticos y las empresas prometen y priorizan aún mayor crecimiento. Frente a esa paradoja y en diálogo con otras vías de postdesarrollo, el descrecimiento ha surgido como una red de movimientos hacia futuros más saludables, futuros como acaba de describir Jacques. Buscamos detener el crecimiento de la huella ecológica humana, alejarnos de las ideologías que glorifiquen y prioricen el crecimiento antes de objetivos, entre ellos la parte individualista que también toca, y 3, reorientar nuestras prácticas, valores, instituciones en torno al cuidado de los recursos humanos y naturales y al bienestar equitativo. En cuanto al crecimiento o descrecimiento del PIB, quedamos indiferentes. Nuestra estrategia no es atacar el PIB, pero dejar esa obsesión a un lado para enfocarnos en otra meta, lo que comunidades andinas llaman el buen vivir. Los de Sudáfrica siguen como Ubuntu, o lo que Jacques Attali concibe como la economía de la vida. Nuestro nuevo libro defiende tal avance en múltiples frentes: prácticas cotidianas, relaciones, diseño, planificación, movimientos sociales y políticos, mitos, conceptos, valores. Y consideramos un conjunto de políticas, ¿no? Green New Deals, horas de trabajo reducidos, renta básica universal, apoyo a las economías comunitarias y el manejo en común, reorganización de las finanzas públicas, todo lo cual podemos discutir más adelante. Así, de muro a muro es un coloquio dedicado a la exploración de nuevos paradigmas en un mundo en transformación. Yo soy antropóloga, estudio toda la experiencia humana en que paradigmas enfocados en el cuidado y regeneración de mundos socioecológicos no son nuevos. Al contrario, son el fundamento de cientos de miles de años de ser humano en la Tierra. Es la expansión perpetua de producción y consumo que tiene poca historia. Tampoco es un proceso natural. Las plantas no crecen hacia el cielo como los frijoles mágicos del Jack. Y los embriones humanos no se convierten en gigantes. En conclusión, nos gustaría que las sociedades elijan y diseñen maneras de priorizar el cuidado humano y ambiental en procesos democráticos, pacíficos, no en desastres y pandemias. Sin embargo, parece más probable que las transiciones sean imprevistas, confusas, en condiciones que no elegimos, como las que estamos viviendo ahora en cuanto a cambio climático, pérdida de biodiversidad, además del COVID. En medio de amargas luchas sobre qué camino seguir durante y después de esta pandemia, nosotros buscamos construir alianzas entre diversas perspectivas y movimientos, lo que no es fácil, y nutrimos de tradiciones humanas que encuentren significado y placer en la convivencia mutuamente enriquecedor con otros elementos naturales. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, doctora Paulson. Me gustaría pasar la palabra a la doctora Lustig y en tratar de entender sus perspectivas sobre, bueno, en primer lugar, los efectos sobre la desigualdad y la pobreza en América Latina de esta crisis que estamos atravesando, pero también tratar de entender su perspectiva sobre cómo es posible salir, digamos, de este modelo tremendamente desigual que estaba ahí antes de la pandemia, pero que solo se agravará como resultado de lo que estamos viviendo, sin crecimiento económico que por lo menos nos lleve a donde estábamos antes.
Muy bien. Bueno, primero que nada, muchas gracias por haberme invitado a este distinguido panel. Quiero pasar ahora al inglés, según ha sido solicitado. So let me start by saying that we are living through one of probably the most brutal and equalizing moments in a long, long time. The pandemic is a generator of vast inequalities in a world where we already were living with inequalities for several reasons. On the health front, we know that the world is divided between those who can actually implement policies to protect themselves and those who can't because they don't have access to being able to isolate themselves depending on their housing or access to water or access to soaps or be able to buy face masks. And there's a group of people that actually can. So that's one inequality dimension. Second, we have also in the health dimension, the group of people who are lucky to be able to continue working without exposing themselves to contagion, and those who can't avoid being exposed to contagion if they want to continue to work. And thirdly, we have a very sharp inequality happening in the economic front, which is because some sectors of the economy are hit particularly hard. We know that those that are hit particularly hard have a lot of the low wage workers, and those are the ones who face more unemployment and reduced incomes. And therefore, you have also an unequalizing process happening in the income dimension. Of course, and I'm sure Salmon will refer to that, we also have inequality of access to health and inequality in the quality of health that people have access to. So we are in an episode of tremendous increases in very unfair types of inequalities, many of which were based on previous inequalities and some that are new. Interestingly, there are two dimensions in which things are less dire. One is inequality between countries is probably not going to increase and it may actually decline, because the hardest hit economies, the ones that are facing the largest contractions in GDP, are not the poorest. We know that the hardest hit are in the advanced countries, and some of the middle-income countries, including our region, are at the top of the line, and that sub-Saharan economies, the ones that are among the poorest, are facing much smaller declines and some not declining at all. Another dimension in which perhaps the pandemic has been less, if you want, horrific than it could have been, is the fact that the death rates are not intense among the young. And I think this is a very important difference compared to the pandemic that happened 100 years ago that affected particularly people in their prime age. I think the pain and the economic challenges that this pandemic would have posed would have been much more difficult if the age distribution is not the one we see. So having said that, now let me go to discussing more precisely what's happened in the region. And as it's been pointed out, we've been doing research on two fronts, particularly in terms of short-term impacts and longer-term impacts that we can expect to happen in Latin America. And so far, we've been working primarily in the four largest countries, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, where most of the GDP and the population is concentrated in the region. And what we find is that, first of all, well, as you know, Latin America has been particularly hard hit on the epidemiological front. It's unfortunately among the top 10 in terms of the rates of infection and death. You have 4 or 5 Latin American countries week after week. It's disproportionately represented in the distribution of infections and death in the world compared to its population share in the world. And economically, it's also facing a huge contraction of GDP, which in many cases we have not seen. I don't know. I mean, we have not seen, not even during the horrible years of the debt crisis of the 1980s, we saw contractions that are expected to happen this year, which go from the order of around 12% in the case of Argentina, and other countries that have been hit less so, Brazil around 5 to 6%, according to the IMF. So within this context, we would expect that poverty would actually rise, and it will rise, and it is rising, but also inequality. Inequality has been rising in the region as a result of the differentiated impact of the pandemic. However, what we've also seen is that depending on the country's response, these increases can be mitigated more or less. Interestingly, we see one country that, this is Brazil, which was able to implement a very large scale program, cash transfer program, which is reaching about 54 million individuals, with a transfer that's sufficiently high to cushion the blow for several months. This, by the way, was not initiated by the right-wing president of Brazil. It was initiated by Congress and by organizations in Brazil, which early on pushed for a very aggressive and decisive response to help particularly the poor and other groups in society that are facing very dramatic declines in their income. By some measures, interestingly, as a result of this major large-scale response, maybe Brazil's poverty rate and inequality rate could be even lower than in the pre-pandemic for a short period of time. But it's still interesting to see that decisive action can actually mitigate these horrible impacts on the economic and living standards front. On the opposite end, we have our host country, Mexico, where, for reasons that to me still seem mysterious, I have to say, there has been no program, no expansion of social assistance in the context of the pandemic. Programs that have been implemented are primarily advance payments of the social pensions in Mexico, but an advancement does not mean that people are going to receive more income in the moment in which they need it most. As a result, when you compare those four countries, Mexico stands out for showing the largest increase in the number of poor in absolute numbers, but also in relative numbers. Mexico stands out as the country that's going to perform the worst. So Brazil is the best in terms of mitigation policies in the short term. Second comes Argentina. A distant third is Colombia, and Mexico has responded with no social assistance, no additional social assistance in the context of the pandemic. So these are the short-term effects, and I think the lesson is that you can probably mitigate the effects if you put in place the right type of policy response. But I want to bring another dimension to the discussion, and this will connect with the last part of Jacques Attali's comments about the next generation. What concerns me the most at this point is not the impact in the short term, because although it is very painful, we can see that actions can actually compensate and mitigate this one. What concerns me the most is what's going to happen to the next generation. The irreversible damage on the human capital of the next generation is likely to have lasting effects in terms of inequality of opportunity in the future and inequality of outcomes in the future for our region. We have been doing some analysis about what is doing the school closure, and I'm not against closing schools, I have to mention this from the start, but the fact that the replacement or the substitution for schooling, for formal schooling, is so heterogeneous depending on the background of the children that are affected by the school closures, is creating a tremendous inequality, a tremendous gap in the likelihood of completing high school in the future for the generation that's being affected today. There's always been a gap between the rates of high school completion among children who come from households in which parents are from low socioeconomic background and low education versus those who come from parents that have higher levels of education. That gap has been exacerbated tremendously during the pandemic in spite of mitigation actions that have been taken by the government. And according to our analysis, this effect could be so significant that for children who were in this cohort, what might happen is that they will actually achieve high school completion rates for children who come from low level of education parents, high school completion rates that were similar to those observed for children born in the 1950s and 1960s. So the retrogression is tremendous. To this, we may add also that there's probably other irreversible damage that's happening to children of poor families that could affect their nutrition and cognitive abilities. And we know that whatever is lost in early childhood is irreversible. So this is the long-lasting damage and the scars that we may have to face in the future unless very decisive action is taken now. So I think that as a focus of policy, immediately and in the next year in particular, you need to implement a series of measures that may remediate this tremendous negative effect on the human capital of children of poor families in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lustig. And finally, Salomon, your opening remarks regarding, well, what we have seen in terms of healthcare and the devastation in several countries, and how will that impact the economic model we're in.
Muchas gracias y saludo de verdad con gusto. Agradezco sobre todo a Nicolás Alvarado y a la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara la invitación. It's a fantastic opportunity to be with Professor Atali, Dr. Lustig, and Dr. Paulson. Let me start by saying that I have to not only agree, but urge us to think the need of a new social and economic consensus for the world. We need, as Professor Atali has written, probably what I would call a new equilibrium between individual rights and collective rights. How do we find the equilibrium between the individual and the better community? How do we build better communities? And this is more needed than probably any time over the last couple of decades, because this century has brought at least two breaking moments. I would say that the first breaking moment was the 2009 economic and financial world crisis. It was a moment of cataclysm in around the world, in which for many years we had been told that economic growth was coming, that there were a certain number of sacrifices that we should do in terms of many structural reforms to have growth, and then after growth comes, then we'll all be better off. In 2009, it was clear that growth didn't came as it was expected, but not only that the growth that the world had was very unequal, and that there were a lot of people, millions of people that were left out from their communities. 2009 was a breaking moment because it was clear that my mortgage and the housing that I was expecting wasn't really mine, that the car that I could buy, it wasn't really mine, and that I was living an expectation that it won't really realize. That crisis brought new types of leadership. It brought populism with it. It brought the Bolsonaros of the world, the Trumps of the world, the Dutertes of the world, and the Andrés Manuel López Obradors of the world. That economic crisis brought a huge new idea on how many people that were left out of the communities were feeling, and they were expressing themselves. The second breaking point came in this year 2020 with the pandemic. This really shook the world. It shook everything that we had believed before, and it creates a momentum in order to rethink which should be our social new consensus. I would say that one of the most important things that we have learned until now is that we need strong states. We need governments that can do the job. I have to really underline that only strong states can implement quarantines. Only strong states can do massive testing and tracing. Only strong states can do massive vaccination. So we need strong states, and that was more clear today than ever. Second, we need states that relearn, that are able to be flexible in order to understand new information, new intelligence, and with that new information, do the things better, reroute themselves, find new paths towards the direction you want to get, but with the new intelligence, information, and scientific evidence that is there available for everyone. In that term, the South Korean example is a fantastic example, because not only they did it really great this time, but they relearned. In 2015, with the MERS, with the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, South Korea did a very poor job. But in 5 years, they did learn what went wrong in those days. And today they did it really, really exemplified. So we need strong states and states that learn in order to develop a new consensus. And only I would point out a couple of the elements that this new consensus have to carry out. One is we need a huge discussion on what do we want for everyone. What should be the social protection network that we want for everyone in a community? Do we want health for everyone? Do we want a health systems that prioritize prevention? Do we want a health systems that prioritize early childhood development, as Dora was saying? We need a better education system. We need a social security on pensions, and we need probably to talk about the basic income. We need to have a huge discussion on what do we want for everyone. Once that we decide what do we want for everyone, then we need to discuss how are we going to pay for that. And that discussion has to bring us to a new fiscal consensus on how societies are going to progressively pay for what we want for everyone. We need to put other things on the table. We need to discuss about labor market. We need to discuss about minimum wage. We need to discuss about women participation on the labor market, on the STEAM, the science, technology, engineer, and mathematics. It is crucial for a better consensus. We need to talk about sustainability. We need to talk about how are we going to put all the pieces together in order to reconstruct societies toward creating real communities in which no one is left aside of that community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salomon. There's a key issue that I've read through all your interventions and some of the works you've published. And it brings me back to a sentence that really struck me in Monsieur Zettali's book. And it goes to the proletarization or proletarization of the middle classes. And it is mentioned in Nora Lustig's works on how some of these emerging middle classes in Latin America could be the most affected in terms of poverty. And it also brings me to the big political question and what role these emerging or disappearing, for that matter, middle classes will play in this new political arrangement. And touching on the degrowth theory, it also makes me question what economic sacrifices would need to be taken if that were the case, and how will this play into the political process of this new social contract that seems to be an recurring theme in all your interventions. I would like to give the word to you, Mr. Attali, and your thoughts on that part.
Yes, everything is in place for more authoritarian regimes. Disparition of the middle class is always something which leads to totalitarian regimes. Never forget that social democracy took place not first in Sweden or in the US. The first social democrat or the first welfare state was Mussolini. The second was Lenin, and the third was Hitler, and Roosevelt was the third. Which means that sometimes in history we have to pass through the caricature of a good system through his authoritarian image. And I'm afraid that the need for a strong state, which I said, and that was repeated by our colleague just after me, the need for more equalities, the need to protect the middle class, if we are not able to give more power to democracy, if we are not able to deal with that, that will lead to targeting the elites, real legitimate or illegitimate elites, that will move to the pointing of scapegoats, and we know where that leads. Then I think it's very urgent to find a democratic way of moving into the direction of new kind of social democracy with strong state, using technologies, moving to a sustainable development. I wouldn't say degrowth, I would say another kind of production. And if we are not able to do that, then we will go through the caricature of a good system before going to the one.
Your thoughts on that, Dr. Lustig?
It's true that what we found is that in the context of Latin America, the sectors of society that are losing more income, relatively speaking, now are in the middle of the distribution, because at the bottom, the introduction of the cash transfer programs that happened in the last 20 years have provided a floor. Now, the middle of the distribution is not just the middle classes. It includes the moderate poor, it includes the group who's right above the poverty lines and are easily affected by a shock and fall into poverty, and some of the middle class. But undoubtedly, we do have a problem, we do have a challenge when that middle becomes impoverished. And what I worry more is that this impoverishment may be a little, it will last into the future, into the next few years, as countries try to rein in the fiscal deficits that were put in place to deal with the shock of the pandemic and the expansion of the various programs that have been implemented. That will have to be paid for, and at some point it will have to be paid for with higher taxes. And if you have to rely on taxes to pay for that, you're probably going to have to tax also people in the middle. and that's going to create more discontent. So, like Jacques Attali mentioned right now, I think that we are in sort of in the threshold of a scenario that it's not auspicious at all in terms of what may be the future of democracy and democratic institutions, at least in the Latin American context. I think that we have reasons to be very concerned.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lustig. Dr. Paulson?
We are so productive. Every society on earth produces more than enough goods and services for what people need to consume, or maybe even want to consume. There's plenty of resources and wealth. I really like the way Solomon proposed populations need to have conversations about what do we want? What do we want to do with that enormous natural wealth we have, and the sort of systems and technologies that allow us to produce so much with that wealth. Do we want the GDP growing in ways that allow the 1% to be more magnificently wealthy? Do we want more preschool? Do we want health for everyone? Those are really profound questions. I'm not worried about being able to pay for them. There's plenty of resources and there's plenty of technology and innovation. It's more of a political decision-making process, but it's informed by the way that we all think and see the world. And I think this kind of fear of taxes that Nora mentioned, there's other ways to think about things, that maybe the natural resources on our shared territories produce dividends that we use to look after the human resources on the territory, which moves out of this kind of language of taxes that has become so politicized and frightening. And one more dimension I really wanted to bring in here in terms of degrowth is the generational talk that everyone mentioned, this question of the future generations. As nations produce more and more economic wealth, they use more resources and create more garbage. There's just no way about it. But wealthy countries have managed to appear that they're clean and wholesome by doing the resource extraction elsewhere in poor, low income, low power countries, and then by actually exporting the waste and damage elsewhere. We call that a spatial fix. There's something simultaneously going on, which we call a temporal fix, which is basically exclude from the accounting sheets of today the kind of environmental damages, the planetary damages that the resilience teams, for example, are studying in biodiversity and ocean acidification, et cetera. We don't count them in our accounting systems. They don't count against our growth right now, but the debt gets paid by the next generations. So we're going to have people, as Nora described, where the human resources have really suffered maybe lasting damage to their development. And at the same time, they're going to take on these debts that we've displaced to them by the temporal fix that allows us to increase our cash production, our cash gains every year, and sort of hide and push off to the future the sacrifices that are going to have to be paid in terms of fixing the disequilibrated Earth systems.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paulson. And Salomon, before we jump to final conclusions, would you like to add on the political implications you see of this rising inequality and on the cost that would be mostly burdened by the up-and-coming middle classes, or let's say the middle part of the income distributions?
My biggest worry is if we need strong states, obviously with democratic checks and balances, how do we avoid the populistic easy response? Because France has been on the last couple of years an example of that. Probably Professor Attali could guide us on how to have strong states with democratic checks and balances and avoid the populistic response.
Well, for that, you need a long history of strong states. In France, we have a long history of strong states. Second, I would say more than 60 years, if not more. If you go to Louis XI from the 13th century, and you need to have also a culture of technology and a strong local administration. Many institutions that are needed for that. It's not a process that it is easy. It is easy to do that on a populistic basis through a wave as a movement. It is not easy to do it if you want to do it democratically. You need to have a lot of intermediary institutions to build it. Therefore, my answer to that will be associations, NGOs, political parties, and local administration. But it's easier to have a dictatorship than a strong democracy.
Before leaving on a sad note, and without having the...
We can do it. We can do it.
Mm-hmm. And the centuries-old institutions of the centralized French state, I would like to ask from all of you, and your concluding remarks can leave on a positive note, and how can we try to face these challenges going forward, as opposed to just talking on the difficulties of the world we have to face these days.
There are urgent issues, which are vaccine and test, and we should take care of that first. And after that, we should take care of the other issues. But first, get rid of that, and we'll see after.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ali. Professor Paulson, if you'd like.
I certainly would, right? So I think, as I mentioned before, alliances are going to be so vital in reaching across differences that have been politicized as antagonistic so far. And so our most immediate case for including degrowth in allied fronts is that the fundamental practices are desirable in and of themselves. Modest living in cooperation and caring with others, convivial sharing and pleasure, building solidarity, communities, regenerating ecological environments, even with no political victory in sight, and some days it feels like that. People in wildly diverse contexts are already exercising and embodying these kind of caring degrowth worlds that give us hope.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paulson. Dr. Lustig, if you'd like to share with us your
concluding remarks. I think that, for me, one of the various reasons to be optimistic, I think that on the scientific front, we have been able to accomplish certain things that would have been unheard of before, including the speed with which we might have a vaccine to deal with the pandemic has been skyrocketed. And I think that we have to be tremendously thankful to the fact that you have the scientists and the institutional processes in place to actually make it happen. Hopefully, like somebody said yesterday, the vaccines will turn into vaccinations and people will be willing to take them, not only because they will be available, because on the pessimistic side is, and I have a very hard time understanding, is the anti-scientific rise that we see in many parts of the world as well, which comes together with populism. The other scientific progress that we've seen, and that may change very much in the positive directions, the fact the way we work, the way we meet, the technology, the digital technology. I think the digital technology is showing that we can do things probably in ways that are much more protective of the environment, and that may make inclusiveness much more easier in the future, as long as it is well directed, because the same technology can be destroyers of jobs and produce an unequal labor market in the future and create more problems in the inequality front that I didn't have time to discuss, but that I alluded to earlier. But I think that science gives us hope, and the fact that we have institutions that are willing to be at the forefront and implement the scientific advances for the good is something very positive, and we should be proud of as humanity that we've been able to do this.
So if I can step in, I think the pandemic give us at least 5 important learnings that we could apply for the construction of this new consensus. Number one is prevention. I mean, it's always better to prevent than to cure. There are a lot of things that we can start preventing since now because we know they are going to happen. So we should start working on the prevention side of the world in general. Second, we need stronger global cooperation or stronger global governance. I mean, viruses, for example, do not respect borders. We need to think as a world because what one country does impacts other countries. So we need more global cooperation. Third, we need to talk about resilience. Bad things happen. We are going to have natural disasters. We are going to have more viruses. How do we stand up after bad things happen and the vulnerability that we have and the possibilities and capabilities that we can build off in order to recover are entirely on us. Fourth, consumption. I mean, I think with all these months spending more time at our houses, we learned that many things that we thought were important, we don't really need them. So it is a good momentum in order to understand what do we really need and what we do not need. And fifth, as Nora Lustig was saying, the importance of science, investing in science, but not only that, putting science and knowledge in front of the decisions. If we prevent, if we cooperate globally, if we learn about the capabilities for our resilience, if we downgrade our consumption and we put science on the center, probably we have all the ingredients in order to construct this new consensus.
Pues muchísimas gracias. Me gustaría agradecer a nuestros 4 participantes y al espacio de Muro a Muro y a Nicolás Alvarado. Espero haya sido de su interés esta mesa. Y pues bueno, quedan muchísimos temas por discutir. Esto es un adelanto de las grandes discusiones que tendremos que hacernos como sociedad y como mundo ante esta crisis que ha sido la pandemia, ante esta transformación de nuestras vidas diarias y lo que querrá decir para los modelos económicos del futuro y de las próximas generaciones, como bien mencionaron nuestros participantes. Muchísimas gracias y los dejo con Nicolás Alvarado.
Gracias, querido Jorge Andrés. Gracias a Jacques Attali, a Suhaila Basbascuri, a Sergio Benvenuto, a Ian Buruma, a Salomón Chertorivsky, a Mohamed El Baradei, a Enrique Krause, a Nora Lustig, a Carlos Moreno, a Susan Paulson, a Rocco Ronchi, a Harmut Rosa, a nuestros 4 espléndidos moderadores, incluido Jorge Andrés Castañeda. Gracias a todos los ponentes que hicieron de Muro a Muro este año el nuevo desorden postviral. Una mesa de reflexión que creo que a lo que apunta, como bien decía hace rato Jacques Attali, es a que es posible encontrar soluciones al cambio de paradigma que vivimos. Al reunir la inteligencia interdisciplinaria del mundo entero, la Feria Internacional del Libro Guadalajara, para discutir, para debatir, para imaginar, para pensar el cambio de paradigma, creo que nos hemos encontrado con más coincidencias que divergencias y creo que nos hemos encontrado con caminos que ahora falta que los gobiernos en todo el mundo escuchen para transformar nuestra realidad. Con esto doy por concluidos los trabajos del coloquio de Muro a Muro para 2020. Nos encontraremos, espero que presencialmente, en 2021. Agradezco también enormemente, por supuesto, a la Universidad de Guadalajara, Casa de la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara, al Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey y la Feria Internacional del Libro de Monterrey, nuestros aliados, y a Latinos, nuestro aliado de medios en esta edición de Muro a Muro. Muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes y por favor sigan porque la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara sigue. Mañana tendremos nuestro foro de políticas culturales, los públicos y lo público, que promete muchísimo. Tenemos también en el radar nuestra mesa por los 30 años del órgano electoral autónomo. En fin, hay mucho todavía en FIL Guadalajara. Muchísimas gracias y muy buenas tardes.
la 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 la